Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another day right here in the community. I'm excited to be able to continue our daily dose of our daily bread with you all. God is faithful to us. I'm grateful to hear of the number of you who are chronicling with the scriptures and thinking about the scriptures, processing the scriptures, asking for the verses, wanting to just really eat of God's word. And we say it often over here, we're maturing. We're growing in God. We're going from levels to levels, deep to deep, right? So thank you for being a part of that. Welcome to the community where we are over here being better together. I'm so glad to see you, Teresa, honey. I think I called for you yesterday. You may have already been in the place. Everybody, why don't you go ahead and do that kind of glance around the room real quick this morning. See if you notice somebody particularly missing. Tell them get on in the room, like Cece. I don't know if she's here. Nigel Pooh. Nikki, Chanel, Lorena, just different people. Look around the room real quick and get them on into the room. Maybe Lena get on up and join us again this morning as we prepare to go into Luke chapter 4, verse number 3. Welcome to the community. That's where we're heading today. Good morning to everybody. And thank you. I wanted to say that as well. I was already glancing. We're only at April the 3rd, and I was glancing at the support that's come in for the community, for myself. And then even for those of you who've signed up to be present for April the 27th, the last Saturday of this month, where we get together out loud together and just have a time connecting. So thank you for that. It feels good to watch you show up and just find support and energy in one another. So let's get ready to go. May he who has begun a good work in us, may he continue to perform it until the day of Jesus Christ, to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. So here's the text. The devil said to Jesus, let me go back and get that right. If you are God's son, tell him, turn this stone into bread. The devil said to Jesus, if you are God's son, tell this stone to turn into bread. If you are God's son, tell this stone to turn into bread. And we know that if is that little word right there that is supposed to generate a sense of inquiry, of asking a question. In some scenarios, it is supposed to, in fact, plant doubt. If. And so as we eat of this scripture today, I want us to already begin to think about that, to think about the moments when the way that a sentence is put into your life or articulated into your life, the particular word that is used, how it can cause you to second guess or have doubt or have inquiry about something that you were sure of. The devil said to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to turn to bread. So here's what's very interesting, very quick, but very interesting about it. After Jesus had been on the earth all of these years, y'all, Jesus had been on the earth approximately 30 years, and he had done all of the things, right? He had been the little boy who was being taught in the temple, whose parents thought he was lost, but he was already sitting at the feet of the teachers, learning about God. He had been the Jesus who had already caused the blind to see. He'd been the Jesus who had already worked certain miracles. He'd been the Jesus who had caused the lame man to walk. Like he had already began to walk in his role. And he's coming into the wilderness, and John the Baptist is there, and John the Baptist baptizes him. And after John the Baptist baptizes him, the Holy Spirit alights on Jesus in the form of a dove, and the voice of God says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." God himself speaks that over Jesus. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. We fast forwarded about 40 days. This is when Jesus goes into the wilderness for about 40 days. And that's when the enemy comes and says, if you are the Son of God. Before we step deeper into that for application into our own lives, I want us to kind of catch that. God specifically says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm pleased. Meaning I identify you, Jesus, as my son. And I also allow you to know that I'm good with it. I like it. I'm here for it. I'm going to stick beside you. Like Jesus is identified and he receives affirmation from God himself. It is then not some random inquiry. It is then not some just haphazard coincidence type of inquiry that the enemy would try to come and through a question raise doubt about what God has said. It wasn't random. God has said, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. The enemy did not come and challenge whether God created the trees. He didn't randomly challenge if giraffes have long necks. He didn't randomly challenge if Jesus was so-and-so's cousin. He comes after the specific thing that God has already said and then gave his stamp of approval on. I highlight that this morning for those of us, right, who may have a specific unction as it relates to our identity, who God has created us to be, what he has preordained and predestined that we do. Do not find it shocking, my sisters, if that is the very area then that the enemy comes to challenge the most. If you are called to be an intercessor, the enemy is not going to work diligently at causing you to second guess your singing ability. The enemy is not going to work diligently if you're called to be an intercessor to cause you to second guess your ability to speak. If you're called to be an intercessor, the enemy is going to make a beeline straight towards your ability, straight towards your confidence in your ability to actually pray. You would probably find yourself struggling with, well, I don't really know what to say. Or I don't like to talk in front of people. Or I don't pray like so-and-so prays. The enemy is very strategic in his attack in all areas, but particularly in the areas that are associated with our identity. He says, if you are the Son of God, it is the exact opposite. It is an exact inquiry. It is an exact attack at what God has said about who Jesus is. I'm going to pause right there just so that you get that, so you can allow that to sink in. For those of you who know that there are certain things that have long been in your heart and in your mind to do, the enemy doesn't have anything new. He's going to replicate this same methodology in our lives. He's going to come to cause us to, he's going to come to attempt to cause us to second guess the very thing that God has created us to do. Many of you know my story where I said I used to go to a certain ministry and I literally would stand outside of the door hoping that the pastor was far enough into the sermon to where he would not impromptu call on me or ask me to have something to say, because I didn't believe that I had anything to say. When I first started out in teaching, I'd been trained for so many years as a middle school teacher where you break down things and you talk about, so what does that look like and all these little things. And so when I began to transition more into teaching adults and teaching biblically versus educational principles, I struggle with trying to transition, trying to speak and use my big words and let y'all know I had studied Greek and got my seminary license, and I want to talk fancy and use a whole lot of big stuff. I felt like, man, I just teach too simple. I just want to break it all the way down, and I want to make sure that people understand it in the nuggets, and I want to do it like I teach middle school kids, and people don't want to hear that. And I really struggled with that until I really embraced that that's who God created me to be, that it's more important for me to be a teacher than a hooper, that it's more important for me to break it down so that you can understand. And there are so many of you who be like hitting the love button and like button. I appreciate that. I like to understand what this looks like in my life. Some of you are able to process that, and you too can see that in the areas where you know you feel particularly called, that's where you struggle the most. I'm going over here to this comment real quick. Yes, thank you, Regina. You said, I'm glad that you're glad that I keep it simple. You don't need a whole lot of fancy stuff. So yes, the enemy desires to point out uncertainty. And so there are a couple of nuggets in there. We're going to pick up from that. Hopefully that will be our takeaways for today, so that we can be just as strategic, just as confident, just as empowered to push back against the enemy. So this is what I want us to see first. It says, and so after Jesus was baptized, God the Father said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Y'all hear this? Then Jesus went out into the wilderness. Then Jesus went out into the wilderness, and after 40 days, the enemy began to speak to him. So many of us know that when Jesus was out in the wilderness, he was fasting, right? Jesus was out in the wilderness. He was fasting. He was going without food. So many of us already know, honey, y'all can meet me in the comments on this little Wellness Wednesday. When we be fasting, honey, them dispositions can get different. Our patience can get different. We can feel worn. We can feel weary. I'm gonna say something here so y'all catch that. Jesus was feeling those ways, perhaps exhausted, tired, hangry, hungry, whatever it was, because he was fasting. Whatever that application is for any of us, when we find ourselves in that state of being, here's what's critical. After 40 days, after time had gone on, perhaps he's even feeling a bit worn down. This is when the enemy spoke today's scripture. This is when the enemy said that. So he wasn't just strategic about what he attacked. He was strategic about when he attacked. So somebody get that. It's not just the what, it's also the when. He wasn't just strategic about what he attacked. He was strategic about when he attacked. It was about 40 days later. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I've been out here isolated. I'm in this wilderness. I'm alone. All of those dynamics are happening. And he comes to Jesus and he says, if you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, then tell these stones to turn into bread. So he begins to try to plant that inquiry, which is supposed to bring about doubt. Catch this. When we find ourselves in those places and life happens, and there are just days when we are tired, when we are exhausted, literally when we are hungry, when we're hangry, when our emotions may not be the best, all of those types of things. Catch what Jesus does. Jesus refused. Jesus refused. He said, man does not live by bread alone. Whatever you're trying to get me to do to prove a point, man does not live by bread alone. What he was saying was, I don't have anything to prove. That thing that you have determined will be the validity of whether I am who God says I am is not what I live on. Turning stones into bread is not the proof that I am the Son of God. Man does not live by bread alone. I live by what God has said about me. Man does not live by what somebody can see. Man does not live by what I can work up and orchestrate and figure out to make you believe what God has said. I live by what God has said about me. Jesus refused to engage in a conversation or a dynamic or a confrontation about who he was to prove a point to somebody for which it was not even worth it. Now, firstly, again, Satan is strategic in what he attacks. What he attacks, he's very strategic. That's not random. He's going against the very thing that God said about who Jesus is. He is also strategic about when he attacks. Jesus is tired. He's isolated. It's been several days. We can then apply that to our lives, and we can really understand that these thoughts that keep coming at my head that are attempting to cause me to forfeit what God has said about me, they are strategic. Most often, even if I'm trying to track, if I'm not even clear, if I'm just trying to track what God has said about me, all I got to do is look at the lie that keeps coming in my head. For some of you who keep saying, I'm just keep trying to figure out my purpose. Sometimes all you got to do is keep looking at the lie that keeps coming inside of your head. And then you're like, oh, that may be a clue into who I'm called to be. Because for some reason, you keep fighting against my ability to own a business. You keep fighting against me, my ability to change generational behavior. You keep fighting against my ability to be a peacemaker. You keep fighting against my unction to write a book. You keep fighting stuff I ain't even doing. So perhaps that is the very thing that I ought to be doing. Otherwise, you would not be fighting it so hard. Are you following me? And then in addition to that, understand that he's probably going to bring those attacks when you're already discouraged, already exhausted, already feeling some type of way. What then am I saying about that as it relates to what Jesus modeled for us? In those moments, that is not the time to try to go toe to toe with the enemy about what God has said over your life. Listen, sis, when you are tired, when you are exhausted, when you're hungry, when you're already having a rough day, when you've already had a life moment, when you're grieving, when you're heavy into something, that is not the time to make crucial decisions about your destiny, about your future, about your job, about your dreams. We model what our big brother Jesus did. Jesus was basically like, I'm not going to even talk to you about that. I'm not going to engage in that. Even though Jesus knew he really could tell the stones to turn into bread, Jesus opted to put away childish behavior. Jesus opted to be so clear about what God has said. He didn't need, and this is what I wrote in my notes, he didn't need to spend time proving his identity. He was going to give his energy to fulfilling his identity. Catch me one more time. He didn't need to give time to proving his identity. He was going to be too busy fulfilling his identity. What does that look like in real time in our lives? Some of us are so busy, y'all, trying to prove our point, trying to engage in arguments and confrontations about it, trying to prove that we're right, trying to get the last word, trying to show them that such and such is so. If you are anointed, you don't have to argue about being anointed. Go ahead and just be anointed. If you're called to cook, you don't have to stand around arguing about who bakes the best cake. Go and go bake the cake. If you're called to start your business, you ain't got to go back and forth about whether it's a good business plan or not with somebody. Just go and go work and use your energy to start the business. So many of us are so engrafted, invested, and committed to our mouths and having these back and forths and trying to get some kind of say and trying to prove a point. Listen, Jesus modeled for us. I'm not going to give energy to proving my identity. I'm going to give energy to fulfilling my identity. While you sitting around arguing about whether Dr. G can teach or not, do you like her teaching? Is she going to get an opportunity to teach? What's she going to do with teaching? Honey, I'm not over here trying to go back and forth with you verbally about what I'm going to do and if I'm going to be called to teach or not. I'm busy teaching. I'm busy teaching here. I'm busy teaching on the radio. I'm busy teaching in the luncheon lifts. I'm busy fulfilling my identity versus trying to prove my identity. When you live it out, you don't have to prove it. It is what it is. Now, here is the thing, though. Many of us feel as if we need the validity. We need the signature of approval. We need the audience of certain folk. That has been our hang up. May we again on Wellness Wednesday do the work of being well so that you're not on hold, you're not on press pause, you're not on waiting until you get this enemy to agree with you. Y'all hear me? You get this enemy to agree with you that you are who God says you are. Think about it. Think about it. Jesus could have talked to the enemy for an additional 40 days. Do we even believe that the enemy was ever going to co-sign on Jesus's identity? Had Jesus spent the next 40 days out there in that wilderness arguing back and forth with the enemy, turning stones into bread, do we actually think that then after that, the enemy was going to actually acknowledge, okay, you really are the Son of God? We have the beauty of being able to read the Bible in hindsight, and we have the beauty to know that even after all of that, even at the point of him dying on the cross and getting up, he was still saying the same lie. I need y'all to get that some of the people that we spend so many hours and days and weeks trying to convince them, the reality is there is nothing that you will ever be able to do to get them to affirm your identity. And sis, you may not want to hear this, but it's the whole truth. Lean in. And in some ways, God has orchestrated that to be so in your life. That's a hard truth. But there are some affirmations and validations that good daddy God has literally orchestrated would never come for you in your life. Why? Because you need it too much. Because you want it too much. Because you give too much value to it. Because in some ways you idolize it. It's the thing that you think will make what God has said about you be enough. In some ways, you put that acknowledgement above the fact that God has already said it is so. In some ways, you want that approval more than you want God to say, well done. How does that show up? Because when God gives you opportunities or chances and you get to do your thing, you don't feel good about what God has done unless that person, that group, that ministry, that pastor, that first lady, that mama, that daddy, that whoever shows up to clap and tell you you did good. Why is God not allowing you to walk in that office, in that role, in that position, in that what action, whatever that is? Why is that not enough for you to understand that you have his approval? So some things God will never allow to be freely given to you because there's something in you that needs to be healed in your relationship with God that allows you to know that if God has settled it, I'm good with it. Somebody meet me in the comments and say, I am who he says I am. I am who he says I am. I am who he says I am. I am, like literally to your spirit man. I am who he says I am. I am who he says I am. As you say it, it's pulling down stinking thinking that we need the validation of man, that we need the validation of the enemy to cause us to believe what God has said. Meet me in the comments, somebody, and say, I am who he says I am. I receive who he says I am. I receive who he says I am. Sometimes we got to talk to our own spirit. We got to say it until we mean it. I am who he says I am. I am. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm created in his image. I am salt and light. I am who he says I am. I am who he says I am. And I receive it by faith. I receive it by faith. I am who he says I am. If you're tracking, go ahead and give me that thumbs up on this morning. So the wellness work is being able to really step back and really process. So why am I here trying to prove stuff? Why am I here arguing with folk? Why am I here going back and forth? Why am I allowing inquiries? See, some of y'all act like y'all don't understand that the inquiry was never about understanding. Honey, when Jesus said unto him, if you are, when the enemy said unto Jesus, if you are, it was never really about the enemy trying to get an understanding. Some of y'all are engaging in conversations and trying to answer questions that aren't even really inquiries. They're posed as inquiries in this if stuff to only engage you. That person is not even really seeking understanding. It's a way to plant doubts into our minds. So for some conversations like Jesus, we got to choose to give that stuff up. We got to choose to not want to argue, to prove our points, to be right, to engage in things that cause us to work at proving our identity versus walking in our identity. And that is our takeaway for today. That's my prayer for each of us, y'all, that God would continue. I know it's Wellness Work Wednesday, so I want to say that God would continue to do the work in us. I don't casually say, so now I teach and speak, like that was an easy thing to transition from waiting outside of a door, not wanting to be called on, to now easily walking up on platforms and podiums and doing what I have to do. It's been a journey between me and God. It's been the work of saying, Daddy God, I fear what man will say. I fear their opinion. I fear I'm not good enough. It's been the inward work so that I can be well within me and be who he's created me to be. And that is my encouragement to each of us, y'all. Let's continue to grow in our dynamics with God, our relationship with God. God is already looking at you and he's pleased. He's created you. Yeah, there's some areas of growth. Yeah, there's some areas of maturity. Yes, we got to pull down some stuff. But the general big idea, God has already established who you are, and he's pleased. As with Jesus, it really doesn't matter what the enemy or people think. You have nothing to prove. When God looks at you, he says, that's my child in whom I am well pleased. Others may say whatever they want to say, but when God looks at you, he says, that's my child. Can somebody meet me in the comments as we prepare to go and just say, I'm his girl. I'm his daughter. Father, I thank you for your daughters on this morning. I thank you that you have begun a good work in us. You're completing it until the day of Jesus Christ. And a part of that good work is that you're causing us to be well on the inside, to be whole on the inside, to be sure about what you've said about us. And we receive what you've said as the final word. Y'all go out today knowing that your identity is settled in God. He says that you are his daughter in whom he's well pleased. I'll see you right back here in the morning as we continue just our daily dose of the daily bread. All right. Y'all loving it so far? Y'all lean on that love button. I'll see you in the morning. As always, I honor the greatness that's on the inside of you.